The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we look back and look ahead at relations between Canada and Indigenous peoples. Then, a check-in on the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta. That's all ahead on the agenda. Relations between Canada and Indigenous peoples have certainly evolved since the agenda first began covering these issues in 2006. There was Prime Minister Stephen Harper's historic apology to former students of residential schools. That was in 2008. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission followed, led by the late Senator Murray Sinclair. The Idle No More movement of the early 2010s, and of course so much more. As we mark National Indigenous History Month, we thought we'd look back at some of these flashpoints in our history and find out how much progress has been made. And with that, we welcome, on the line from Kanesatake First Nation in Quebec, Council Chief Serge Simon. In Orillia, Ontario, Cynthia Wesley Eskimo, the Chair of Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead University. And with us here in studio, Karen Pugliese, journalist and instructor at Carleton University, and Riley Yesno, PhD candidate in political science and Indigenous studies at the University of Toronto. And it's great to see you two again here in our studio. And to our friends in Points Beyond, thank you for making yourselves available for us here on TVO tonight. Let's start our discussion talking reconciliation. And we just want to show some numbers here. The Environics Institute did some surveying on whether people thought we will make meaningful progress towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And for those listening on podcast, I'm going to sort of explain the charts a little bit here because we're throwing a whole ton of numbers your way. Essentially, this first chart shows progress towards reconciliation, Indigenous peoples surveyed, and the numbers as the years increase seem to be somewhat more buoyant, somewhat more optimistic. And if we compare that to non-Indigenous people, the numbers are quite optimistic and have stayed fairly static over the last 4 years. And I guess I want to start by just finding out what you folks read into all of that. Cynthia, get us started if you would. What do those numbers mean to you?
Well, you know what? The numbers mean a certain kind of thing to me on the ground, and they mean another thing entirely when we look at the national picture right across Canada. Because what I'm finding with the work that I do is that there's a lot of people that are very close to the ground at churches, community centers, places like that, that are very engaged with the conversation around truth and reconciliation. So that's what I'm seeing. So I see it as being pretty positive.
Chief Simon, how do you see it?
Well, it's encouraging. You look at some of the numbers where it's increasing, but you also have a range between 11% and 16% of people who really don't have a clue. So it shows that there's a lot of work still to be done when it comes to the general population of Canada and its understanding of First Nation issues, of why we are the way we are, who we used to be, and how we struggle on trying to preserve what's left of our identities. So reconciliation is a huge work in progress.
Understood. Karen?
I think the biggest change that I've seen is amongst Indigenous youth. I mean, when you think about it, or when I think about reconciliation, I've often thought that it's not necessarily something that other people are going to do. It's something that First Nations people, Inuit people, Métis people are going to do for ourselves. And there's been a big change in how confident we are about the world, and also just in how our children are growing up with a foot in Western education and a much stronger connection to their culture. A lot of times when I was growing up, I really had to be shown how to do things, how to do ceremony. And kids now, they just know how to do it. And so when I think about reconciliation coming, I think of it really growing from that young generation.
Riley.
Yeah, I'm echoing a little bit of what Karen's saying there, in that I found the stat surprising, and I wonder if you broke it down by age demographic or any other sort of, aggregates, that if it would be different. One of the things I also am a bit skeptical of is this sort of, I guess I'll call it like a visibility bias, and that I'm skeptical in terms of the work that we've actually done of reconciliation has been what it should be and where we should be at. But I do think that reconciliation is a bigger conversation now than it certainly was 5-10 years ago, that we have land acknowledgements and apologies and orange shirt days. And so that can very easily, I think, give the impression that a lot of work is being done, and maybe it's a conversational shift, but I'm still not sure about the actual material changes that, like, the TRC articulates, for example.
Okay, let me follow up with Cynthia in that regard, which is, I know it's heretical to say anything nice about Justin Trudeau in this country these days, but I think the fact is that he put Indigenous relations and reconciliation on the national agenda in a way that none of his predecessors ever did. And is it possible these numbers reflect those efforts?
I would say probably. Again, there's so many different things going on. Everybody's right. There's stuff going on at so many different levels with this conversation. The truth is still very much a part of the survivors conversation. I have those kinds of conversations at the National Center on a regular basis. But I think that Trudeau handing that over to Carney, I think there's some movement there. But again, I always tell people it's not the government's total sole responsibility to make truth and reconciliation happen. They definitely have to play a role, but it's the churches, it's law. There are 18 calls to action for law that I don't see a lot of movement on. There's education, there's child welfare, there's a lot going on. And I think that the responsibility for that is not clear to the Canadian population. They keep thinking it's the government supposed to do everything. And I keep telling people, no, it's everybody that's supposed to be doing something. And that includes people that say that they're not aware of what's happening.
Having said that, Riley, do you believe the creation and the recommendations put forward by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has played a significant role in people thinking something constructive is happening right now?
I think so. I mean, when I look at, for example, the Yellowhead Institute's analysis of the calls to action and how much progress has been made on them, I believe it's 13 as of their last counting that have been done, which is a very small number of the 94, obviously. And at that rate of completion, I don't think that they're supposed to be done until 2080. And so to me, that's a failure of action. But also, when you take a more qualitative look at which ones have been completed, there are these ones that fall under the legacy reconciliation category. So things like a national holiday, things like the murdered missing Indigenous women and girls inquiry. Not bad things, but things which, unless further acted upon, don't, change the day-to-day living conditions of Indigenous people. But they do certainly give an impression that a lot is happening when we see it in our news feeds and online and all of that. So I definitely think that there's a tie there, like you're mentioning.
Chief, what do you think about the issue of the TRC leading to a more optimistic sense in the land that something's happening?
Well, considering where I sit, Ganasadaga is the site of the 1990 Oprah crisis. I remember that morning I was up in the pines when the shooting started, and I swear I could still hear the crackling of those bullets passing by me. Now, from there to where we are now, yeah, there's significant progress for sure. And I think we've learned from those mistakes that when we stop listening to each other, when we stop, when we start looking at things, I guess, in a more beneficial way, self-interest for both sides, I think we can make progress. So I don't know, the 35th anniversary of the Oka crisis is coming up, and every year my stomach cringes, not knowing what to expect here locally. And but I think things have evolved to a point where we use 1990 as a lesson of how do we avoid this. And yeah, Justin Trudeau has made significant progress when it comes to Indigenous relations, but everybody seems to forget that he's a prime minister. He's subject to economic stresses. There's industry, international law. A lot of things come into play that make it difficult for a prime minister to unilaterally change things the way he wished things were. But despite that, First Nations economically, socially are making progress. There's always going to be some of us that are struggling, yes, but as long as we have a partner that's willing to listen.
Well, let me jump in there, Chief Simon, if I could, because we did some listening on this program 14 years ago when we had the pleasure of having the good Senator Murray Sinclair on our program, and we talked about all of these issues. So let's play a clip from that discussion 14 years ago. Sheldon, if you would.
The one thing we remind members of the public about is while they were teaching Aboriginal students in these schools that their cultures were inferior, their languages were inferior, and their historical existence was irrelevant, they were teaching the very same thing to non-Aboriginal children in a public school system. And so Canada has raised population upon population of people. Generations now of people have been raised with this particular attitude and information about Aboriginal people, which is just wrong. And what we need to understand is it's this education system that got us into this situation where this relationship is so bad. And it's going to be the educational system that's going to get us out of it. We're going to have to look at ways of ensuring that children who are educated in the future, Aboriginal children and non-Aboriginal children, are educated fully, properly, and adequately about the residential schools and their impact on our society.
Karen, is that happening now?
Yes and no. I mean, it depends very much on the school. And there's the older generation. Like I remember Senator Murray Sinclair, when he was a senator, saying that he found it frustrating to be working with people who had never recognized Indigenous governments as real governments and had never really recognized Indigenous rights as real rights. So on one hand, I think universities, depending on the university, are making headways to teach more. High schools are making headway to teach more, and we're probably going to see an intergenerational difference. But I just want to go back to the conversation we were having a little bit about Justin Trudeau. I think we're all going to see how much he was actually driving reconciliation, however imperfectly he was doing it, because while he was making great progress in some areas, he was still fighting, compensation for child welfare and some other things that was very schizophrenic, didn't seem to make sense. But now we've got a new Liberal government in who's had a series of meetings with premiers and not invited Indigenous governments to the table to discuss things that are going to be happening, like resource extraction on their land. So the Liberals giveth and the Liberals taketh away. What can I say?
I'm going to come back to both Bill 5s. It's interesting. The number 5 shows up federally and provincially and all of that. But okay, I mean, Cynthia, obviously you've spent a lot of your life in the educational sphere. Following up on Murray Sinclair's comments, do you think we are better placed today for most people to have a better understanding of the educational history of this country?
I think we are, because not only because of that, but also the work that I do with the BAMP Center. I have people coming from all across Canada. They want to know. We have Indigenous people showing up. They want to know more about it. And we're delivering public education hugely across from the National Center on Truth and Reconciliation. We hit at least 3 million people a year that we're actually updating and upgrading. These are kids in grade 6, 7, and 8. The university's done their job of putting those 13 principles in. I mean, we're doing our level best to try to reach as many people as we possibly can. Are we doing the best job? Probably not, but I think every university across Canada now has an Indigenous center of some kind. They're recognizing that this is an important conversation, and they're doing whatever they can to ensure that their students get the kind of education that they need.
Riley, where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school in Thunder Bay, St. Pat's.
St. Pat's and Thunder Bay. How much did you learn about Indigenous history, education, etc. in that school?
I mean, not much, which is wild because I didn't go to high school that long ago, and also because Thunder Bay is, a place that has a really high Indigenous population, and so you'd think that if there was going to be a school or a city that was doing more work at that time, that it might have been Thunder Bay. That said, I've been really surprised by how quickly things shift and change. My brother is 5 years younger than me, 6 years younger than me, and when he was in school, then suddenly the curriculum had vastly changed, and he had land acknowledgements and was learning about the Indian Act and learning about all of these things, whereas for me, it was the experience that I hear actually a lot from older people, which is like you learn mostly about World War I and II, you open the textbook and you get one chapter on Indigenous people and then close it. And that was kind of the extent of what I had received. But where changes have been made, I've been really impressed by how quickly and how ferociously they've kind of gone into that.
All right, let me come back to the 5s. We're talking Bill C-5 coming out of Parliament and Bill 5 coming out of Queen's Park, because the observation has been made already that first ministers in this country have been having significant consultations about how to move so-called nation-building projects forward, and there have been significant omissions at that table. And I guess, okay, Chief Simon, let's start with you. I wonder if you see the potential for a movement like Idle No More to come back if Indigenous people are not adequately consulted while both levels of government pursue these so-called nation-building exercises.
Well, Idle No More is just one part. I remember between 2014 and 2018, we were fighting Energy East, we were fighting Trans Mountain, Line 9 going through Manitoba. And what came out of that was the Treaty Alliance against the expansion of the tar sands. At one point, exhaustion kind of took over, and I kind of fell back on it and let other people take over. And this is one of the things that I hope people learn, that when we combine our powers together, we can make significant changes to protect the environment. So right now, I'm not sure where the Treaty Alliance is, who's taken it over, but I hope we can rekindle that and remind the governments and in the international monetary fund and the oil industry that we have a say. It's our land. And you look at the state of the planet and where it's going, I think we have even more of a responsibility today to take that kind of action, combine our powers, whether it's through a treaty or some formal agreement between First Nations. We can force progress.
Well, in fact, Karen, the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that Indigenous communities have a say, not a veto, but a say. There is the duty to consult. What are you seeing on that front these days?
Well, I mean, that's the key case that's come out has been from Eagle Village in Quebec, where they were fighting a nuclear power plant that some people might be aware of in Ontario that was going to be along Chalk River. And the courts went back to them and still didn't say veto. And actually, veto is becoming a dirty word because it indicates that Indigenous people are maybe against development. But I will say veto, because I just think it's the clearest word that we can use. But they said that definitely the Canada's adoption of UNDRIP into law under the UNDRA Act, that's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, a lot of mouthful, does obligate people to consider Indigenous laws. So it's interesting in other countries what Indigenous groups have done is they just said, you know what, we're going to come up with our own laws. And we are going to push on free, prior informed consent and the right to withhold consent. If you do not have the right to withhold consent, then basically what happens is things are the way they are. The government asks First Nations people, do you have concern? And they say, we have these concerns. And they say, well, we'll accommodate that. And now development can go ahead whether you like it or not. And that's a problem.
12 and a half years ago, we talked about that on this program with the very same Cynthia Wesley Eskima, who is here today. Sheldon, roll the clip.
Those communities were absolutely functioning communities for thousands of years before the federal government interfered in their livelihoods and in the way where they lived. The Attawapiskat community is sitting on a floodplain, not because they wanted to be there, but because they were forced to be there by a government who wanted to be able to have access to them. In the 50s, many communities across the north were moved out of their traditional territories and put into towns and put into places where the land was poor and there was no resources for them to work with. And now we're coming back saying, oh, gee, you know, these people can't live where they are. If people understood the history of this country better, they would understand that we created that in the South. And I say we simply because I live in the South, but we created that as a Canadian state. They did not create that themselves.
Cynthia, do you think people, generally speaking, across the country have a better sense about what you and others were fighting for a decade and a half ago?
Well, I'm certainly doing my best to inform them about those facts. I keep telling them on a regular basis, you know, it is us here that have put people in settlements and taken them off the land. We're the ones that have, you know, quantified their food sources. We're the ones that have polluted their waters. So we have a better life in the South. We have every right to stand up against these bills, and they're just not listening when it comes to that. Development seems to be the way everybody thinks that we should go. And I'm telling you, We're killing the planet and we're killing a lot of people I think somebody said a long time ago, you can't eat money. We have to fight against it. Our young people are getting ready. They're more informed. They're more, that two-eyed seeing. They know the Western world. They know their own world. They know their ceremonies. They're getting ready. We have to support them and we have to guide this conversation because we have a right to be at those tables.
Riley, what about it? Do you think people have a better understanding? I'm talking non-Indigenous people now. Do they have a better understanding of why blockades happen, why hunger strikes happen, why protests happen? What do you think?
Oh, man. I don't know. I feel like maybe to steal Karen's answer from earlier, yes and no. Like, for example, would I say today most Canadians know about treaties? Sure. Would I think that they could tell me any bit of the content about them, what their treaty obligations are, when they were signed, what that all means? No. So, I mean, maybe there's a general awareness that has grown, but I think a true, meaningful understanding that transforms the way they think and walk through this country is still yet to be seen by a massive part of the population. And so that's the type of education work that I think the Senator was talking about there is not just you need to know what happened, you need to have an awareness of what happened, but you have to be willing to also let that change you, I think is the unspoken part of that. And I'm still waiting to see that really embraced, I think, in full.
Well, let's see if that's reflected in some numbers here, because we're going to talk about land now, and we're going to show some more polling numbers. This was done by Leger Marketing for the Association for Canadian Studies, and it was reported in the National Post. And they asked a very simple question. I live on stolen Indigenous lands. Yes or no? That's the question. 27% of those surveyed said yes. 52% said no. The rest did not know. But when you break it down by age, you find some very interesting findings here. Those who responded, yes, I live on stolen Indigenous land, the younger you are more likely to believe that. Ages 18 to 24, 41% believed it. And then as you get older, going all the way down to 65 plus, only 15% believe it. Karen, what's the significance of that?
Oh, I think I really liked that survey for showing the age breakdown because I think it shows like a political awareness, and I think it shows that education and universities are doing the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission asked them to do. The one thing that I had with the survey that I thought might be a little bit of a wording problem was about the stolen Indigenous land, because there's definitely stolen Indigenous land in Quebec, in BC, but in other places there were agreements by treaty. So somebody saying no in certain provinces might actually be able to acknowledge that they're on treaty land, but it's not quite the same as being stolen. So
there's no nuance in that question.
There's no nuance in that question.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But back to the point about age, I thought that was very interesting and very comforting, positive. Yeah.
Chief Simon, the Land Back movement is something that started in 2018, maybe even a little bit earlier, actually. Do you think it's working to have the desired effect that so many in your world want?
The Land Back movement has been around for about 275 years.
Well, fair point.
It's not
Okay.
something new. When you're looking at those, like my nation has treaties with the British Crown. Now, from the territory we were promised to be left alone in, 260 square miles for Ganasadaga, we only have like maybe 2 or 3% left of it that we're actually occupying. The rest has been literally stolen. And what we see here, I guess we can interpret that as the word of the Crown isn't worth the paper it's written on. Our treaties were very clear. 1760, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, 1764 Treaty of Niagara, 1812. I mean, we could go on and on and on. And we're not talking about the treaties in the United States that still have meaning and I think legal meaning on our communities here in the Canadian side. So it's nice to see that the Truth and Reconciliation is having an impact on the education system and clearing up the old racist ideals of this land is ours by right of might. And that slowly being washed away. But what do? Once this is cleared, how do we work with the non-Indigenous people living on these stolen lands? And how do we make it economically beneficial for both sides? They're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere. The Crown can't wash its hands of this whole matter. So we really got to sit down and start talking about changing the policies of Canada. The Supreme Court keeps telling the Canadian government, you have to do this, you have to do that. And the government, and I've said this to the minister before, your policy does not trump the Supreme Court decision on how you should act with our people when it comes to treaty rights.
Cynthia, your reaction to those numbers?
Well, of course, I'm delighted, but I can also say that because I've been working in the university system for the last too long, that of course that has to be happening because we do have young people that now know so much more than they ever did before. And some of that is mandatory. We have residential school knowledge mandatory across the north. They take it from K up. So they're being raised with the understanding that these lands have treaties, and maybe they don't necessarily know exactly what those treaties are about, but they do understand that those treaties have meaning. They do understand. And if you look at a map of Canada today and you see Nunavut and you see the Cree and you see what's happening in BC and you see those tables that have been set and actually completed, you see a change across the entire country. So there is kind of land back. It's just that in the South, we're so populated by other people that that's not going to be as easy to do as it is in the North where it's mostly Indigenous. But we have to keep that in mind because I think it's important and we have to keep pushing.
Let me put a new issue on the table. It was almost a decade ago that the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls started holding hearings, and we got a report released in 2019 with some recommendations on that. Riley, how far have we come on that issue?
I think similarly to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that it did a lot to maybe raise awareness of the issue, but when it comes to the parties that were assigned the calls for justice and how many of those they completed, I think that we're maybe looking at 8 of those by my last counting, so not a lot of substantial action on that front. But where we might be missing some sort of top-down leadership, I do think that there are a number of grassroots initiatives that have been taking place that I'm really heartened by. Yes, it's piecemeal. Yes, it's left up to the prerogatives and the resources held by individuals and their institutions. But things like the Moose Hide campaign has done incredible work and done work that has been led by Indigenous voices. That we've been talking about the cases of murdered Indigenous women and girls more than I think we had in decades previous. And so bottom-up change, I see a lot of hope on, even if the top-down isn't looking as promising as it should have been.
Karen, your view?
I think I liked what you said about grassroots movements. I think that's where things are happening and staying happening. I did a sweep of media and the kind of coverage that missing and murdered Indigenous women were getting right up until the 2019 inquiry. And it was getting higher and higher, and right after, it dropped down again. So I think it's out of the bigger public sphere. And I also think that Indigenous women don't feel safer. And that's the real test. Are there more places for Indigenous women in remote communities to go if they're experiencing violence? And the answer is no. Do I feel less likely that I am going to disappear? Do I feel less likely or more likely that the police would go searching for me? Absolutely not. The fact that I'm actually on air is the one thing that I think that if I went missing would force the police to actually look for me.
Cynthia, your view on whether we have any more trust for national policing institutions in this country in Indigenous communities?
No, I agree with them. I think the grassroots piece is very positive. In the North, they put on those buses right after the inquiry was, or when the inquiry was running right after, and then they took them off. So that people in the North could travel down towards Vancouver. They took them off. There's no conversation happening about this that I think is significant, and I think we have to bring it back to the table on a regular basis. And it's like anything that is a little bit squirmish for people, then it gets buried. Whether it's the missing children, whether it's the residential schools and the horrors that happen there, and whether it's missing and murdered Indigenous women, it's like, well, we don't really want to talk about that. We'll talk about history, we'll talk about the United Nations Declaration, we'll talk about things that we can sort of relate to, but we don't want to talk about those things. And I think we really need to put that back on the table and ensure that women feel safe. I've got 4 daughters. And I really would like them to be safe, and I'd like my grandchildren to be safe.
Right on. With 5 minutes to go, I want to come back to the fives, and that is the Federal Bill 5, C5, and the Provincial Bill 5. And I want to make sure, Chief Simon, I'll get you in on this first. I want to make sure that everybody understands where there is support and where there is not, because I have had it explained to me, and Chief Simon, you can tell me if this is fair. I have had it explained to me that much of the opposition to a lack of consultation or a desire for partnership on nation-building projects comes from First Nations, which are actually not in the area of the areas intended for the projects. That much of the opposition is from elsewhere, and that many of the First Nations who are actually on the land that is intended to be built on are actually looking for partnerships and are more positive about these potential so-called nation-building projects. True or false, in your view?
I think it's relatively false. There's so much that needs to be discussed. It's not a matter, like, it's a national building to build their nation, but in the end, when you're looking at some of these projects, it's to destroy my interests, my nation's interests. So you're looking at C5 as basically what they're trying to do is make it easier to pass these, let's say, these pipelines through one province to another. What happens to treaty rights in C5? What happens to First Nations incorporation structures? Can we actually fight these projects? Because consultation is a dirty word. I mean, like it was mentioned a while ago, they'll consult you on the project, and in the end, well, you have a say whether they take that say and actually make a change according to that. That's another matter. But
well, let me put this to Riley then. Let me say, if First Nations were made partners in these projects, if there were guarantees for X number of jobs for First Nations people, would that help?
I think it would help, but I don't think that, to the earlier statement, I don't think it's true. As somebody who comes from also the Ring of Fire communities, my community is one of the very ones at the heart of what they're trying to do in Ontario and developing and mining. I think that it's ignorant of the fact that there's always been this opposition there. And a lot of those communities in the Ring of Fire and elsewhere, to Karen's point earlier, do say that they are not necessarily anti-development communities, that they want these partnerships, that they do want jobs, that they understand that there needs to be some economic growth up there, but not at any cost, not at the cost of the environment, not at the cost of never being able to actually say no. It's funny the way that it feels like, yes, veto is a dirty word for us, but Canada has no problem vetoing our no's. They get to do that whenever they want, right? And so I think that I'm really proud of the way that these communities in these regions have held out, even if they do want the money, even if they do want the project, to say, we're not going to do it on any terms and not on your terms. If we're going to do it, we're going to do it in a way of like true, genuine partnership that I don't think has yet to be seen, and certainly isn't being helped by the passing of these bills under a lot of protests, which certainly isn't being helped by a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Queen's Park right now. And so I think they're actually getting farther away from that ideal rather than closer.
We got about a minute to go here. Karen, let me give you 30, and then Cynthia can take the last 30 and talk about how we get to, or whether we can get to, yes, for both sides on this issue.
Yeah, there needs to be consultation. First Nations may want to hold out for better circumstances environmentally. They may want to hold out for, they may have their own ideas to develop ecotourism or something that is different from resource extraction. And so there needs to be consultation, or it all falls apart. And just to the point that you mentioned earlier, we don't know where a lot of these national projects are going to take place. And so it's false to say that, First Nations are mostly in agreement, because nobody knows where they're going, especially with C5, the federal bill.
Gotcha. Cynthia, last word to you.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing that's always been missing in these conversations is the fact that the First Nations, the Métis, Inuit, whoever's actually at the table, or not at the table, I should say, are never given an opportunity to have a choice. And I think that they need to listen to what they have to say. And all of those factors that just got mentioned are absolutely paramount. We cannot just run over people because of development and because of capitalism. We need to be encouraging the people themselves to be sitting at the table, to give their part on it and ensure that we protect this planet.
We have been delighted to welcome the four of you numerous times to our program so that you could sit at our actual and virtual table on this show over the last many years. So my thanks to Council Chief Serge Simon from the Kanesatake First Nation, Cynthia Wesley Eskimo from Lakehead University, Karen Pugliese, Carleton University, Riley Yesno. Riley, when are you getting your PhD finally?
Oh, God, that's the question, isn't it? I hope this next year. I hope this year.
We hope so, too. We hope so, too. Thanks to all four of you for your great contributions to our program over these many years. With global trade being the focus of this month's G7 summit, can Canada reach an agreement with the U.S. to resolve their trade dispute? For more about the policy implications of the G7, we're joined by Paul Sampson. He is president of CIGI, the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and he joins us now from Banff, Alberta. Paul, it's great to have you on the program. How are you doing?
Thank you. Great to see you. Everything's good here.
Well, what's the atmosphere like there? I think that's where we want to start.
Super busy. There's so much going on with all those leaders arrived and now all the other leaders. There's actually another G7 worth of leaders for meetings tomorrow. Today's starting off with bilaterals.
Yeah, when you say bilaterals, just give us a better understanding of what that means. Is it literally just the two heads of government, or are there other staffers in the room, or what?
Well, in the case of Prime Minister Carney and President Trump, I understand it literally is just a tete-a-tete. There might be one or two others in the room, maybe not. It's the smallest it gets. Some of the other ones will be bigger, where there will be full delegations, half a dozen or so in these bilateral meetings. But they're pretty small, and they're generally not open to the media at all.
Gotcha. Let me ask you about an issue that I know you care deeply about, and that is you are the convener for something called Think 7, which is a group of leading think tanks from G7 countries and beyond. And I'm told that you have drafted your own communique and presented it in April to the G7 leadership. And on the top of your agenda was getting them to address AI. Do you know for a fact that they will, in fact, deal with that at this summit?
Yeah, we did do a big process called the think7.org. You can find all the recommendations online. AI was at the top of the list, cutting across all the issues, whether it was energy, security, cooperation on supply chains. It was the top of list for us, and they will be talking about that absolutely here. I understand AI and quantum technologies are going to be a substantive discussion, as they were yesterday in Ottawa with the PM Starmer in a bilateral that happened.
I'm going to ask a really nasty follow-up question here, which is, given that the President of the United States has violated so many norms as it relates to taking money from industries related to artificial intelligence, and therefore wants to gut so much of the regulation that could be in place as it relates to artificial intelligence, what possible hope do you have that something constructive is going to come out of all this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's definitely America first, and there's a lot of Trump first as well, as you're saying. But there are common security risks, right, around cyber attacks that would be coordinated, or bioweapons, coming out of AI. So the U.S. has an interest to cooperate on those kind of things. And then supply chains, getting these data centers powered with energy, Canadian energy probably in many cases. It's important to the U.S. as well to cooperate a bit here. Otherwise, it's America first and Trump first, as you say.
Well, where does that leave the rest of the world?
They're trying to get in, right? That's partly why everyone else is here. The European leaders want a piece of the action. They don't want to be left out on AI. India will be an important partner. Brazil, Indonesia, the other ones that are here, South Korea, Australia, the UK. So they all want a piece of the action, and it's with big U.S. companies and America first. It's tough. But there's shared interests. There are some.
There may be shared interests, but there's no interest greater than the companies that have directly put money into the president's personal pocket. I mean, how do you get past that?
Well, those companies have a huge amount of influence in Washington. Their representatives are in high positions. They've got a lot of power. But there are some things they can't do in the U.S., so they need some cooperation. Let's hope that it's more rather than less, but it's not easy, as you say, absolutely.
Okay. I want to ask you about whether you think, well, let me take a step back. Under normal circumstances, convicted felons would not necessarily have the right to come into Canada. The President of the United States is a convicted felon. Many people wonder whether he should have been invited at all. What's your view on that?
Well, I think you'd have a question there for various leaders over time, right? Are you going to have a dialogue and work with those leaders? You need to, or are you going to say, no, you can't come into the country? I think from a pragmatic perspective, that's going to apply to the United States and other countries as well. So I think it was an easy decision for the government of Canada. They've got to work together.
Yeah, but there's a group of people out there in the country that would love to have been able to send a message to the United States by not inviting him. But you think that would have been a bad move?
I think I understand where they're coming from, and there's a legitimate view there. But do you want that? Imagine how much that would have blown up, right? Probably, certainly with the Trump White House. But I think also typical Americans would have said, "You're not willing to meet with our elected president." I don't think that would go over well.
Well, all right, take the next step and tell those people who would rather he not be there, what's the urgency in having him there? Why is it so important?
Well, Canada's hosting the G7 and the United States is part of the G7, right? So everyone, all those leaders are invited. So to exclude one would have been extremely unusual. So I think that's the reason. Would Canada have had a bilateral just between Prime Minister Carney and President Trump? Maybe not. Maybe not in Canada. Maybe not at this time. But the G7's happening, and he's the president of the United States.
Okay, let's talk about something that really has fallen off the country's radar screen over the last many months, and that is climate change. There are wildfires happening in the north of our province. There are wildfires happening in Alberta. We saw what wildfires just did in Los Angeles, California several months ago. These are significant and daily reminders about the different world in which we live today and what climate change is doing. Do you suspect any of that is going to get a hearing at this summit?
They're talking about energy security here, and that'll be a big deal. That opens up the door to, transforming the economies, decarbonizing industry, et cetera. So they will talk about it a little bit. There won't be any statement on climate change from the leaders. There won't be, anything really about climate change specifically, and certainly not mitigation targets or the Paris commitment, that kind of thing. They're starting to think seriously about adaptation, though, as you say, because of forest fires and other things that are now just part of our lives.
How disappointed should we be, in your view, that one of the most important existential issues for the planet isn't going to make the cut at this conference?
Yeah, I think it is disappointing, right? Like, as you say, it's the top of the list for global issues. How can you not talk about it? I guess the answer would be if you're stuck at the G7, go hard in those other settings, like the UN Convention on Framework Convention on Climate Change is meeting later this year. The stakes are going up and up for those meetings.
At the risk of using a word, the economy trumps everything these days?
It does right now because because of the tariffs, because of the economic uncertainty, because of debt levels. Economic growth isn't very high. Every one of the G7 countries is like, how do we squeeze out a bit more growth in order to pay for healthcare, in order to do the environmental protection we'd want to do? So it's not surprising that they're very focused there, but it's unfortunate when it squeezes out everything else, as you say. Totally agree.
A couple of minutes to go. I want to put two more issues on the table. How much has the conversation been affected by what's been going on between Israel and Iran over the past few days?
It's huge because that is a core conflict. Anytime something blows up in the Middle East, it's a big deal. Right now, that conflict is escalating. It's a tit for tat, but each response is a little bit more than the last one. And there's a real concern it could escalate further and then spill over into a broader conflict or involve other countries. So huge deal. I'm not sure they're going to make any specific progress on it here, but it's certainly looming very large in the background.
Well, let me ask about progress or not for another conflict area in this world, and that, of course, is Russia-Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky is at this conference, or has been invited to be at this conference, let's put it that way. What impact do you believe he can make by having access to all the G7 leaders?
So he'll be part of the discussions tomorrow where they open it up beyond the G7 countries. He'll have some bilateral discussions. I feel like this is very valuable for him to have all the leaders there together, and potentially the U.S. will be a little bit more conciliatory until it isn't, right? There's a lot of flip-flopping and back and forthing on what the U.S. policy actually is on the Ukraine, in my view. I think they might make a little bit of progress, but it's going to have to involve the Russians as well, and that'll take place elsewhere after the G7.
Gotcha. Paul, that was a great primer on what we should be looking towards over the next few days. So we're really grateful you could spare some time for us on TVO tonight. Paul Sampson, president of the Centre for International Governance Innovation, coming to us from Banff, Alberta. Thanks, Paul.
Good to see you, Steve. Thanks a lot.
Up like probably all other, equestrians and people, in believing that the horses came to Turtle Island or North America with colonization. And I think that's a really common belief. And, for a long time, our elders have said through our oral history that the horses were here, the ponies were here. And so an important discovery and path with these Ojibway spirit horses has been collecting those oral traditions and histories of the elders and, the generations that had the connection with the ponies. But it's now been backed up by, they have separate DNA, so they are genetically distinct from the horses that came with the Spanish. It just really supports our elders' teachings that the ponies were here and living, in partnership with our communities for many years before the settlers came.
Very curious ponies, aren't you? Hey, you're very curious ponies. Yeah.
So we are here today at Madawaki Farm, which is an Anishinaabe word which means to share the land. While we've been in Indigenous tourism for almost 25 years, we were really struggling to find a place where we could have more land-based learning and experiences, and we came across this farm, and so we opened in 2021. Farm might seem an unusual venue for an Indigenous tourism experience. We had come across the Ojibway spirit horses, and we really knew they were part of the story we wanted to share and kind of how it mirrored our story, our community's story, in terms of being taken from the lands and the resilience of still being here in that connection. Madawaki Farm, it's really allowed us to, create these interactive experiences, share our Indigenous cultures, support that path to reconciliation. We create employment, self-employment, small business opportunities through a vast array of activities. So we have a lodge where we can welcome groups for year-round experiences.
Drums, it's pretty universal across North America, but there are many different types of drums. My name is Wema Tendesi, and I'm a cultural ambassador here at Madawaki Farm. I really do a lot of facilitating. I'm the one who greets you at the door, and brings you through all your programming for that day. I've been singing since I was a little guy. It's one of those things where, again, it's a responsibility. I was taught that, these drums are tools, that they're not toys, and that you have a responsibility to your community. It's my responsibility to sing the proper songs at the proper time. So I have to learn many songs, and I have to learn songs for specific times. So when I sing for you, if I'm going to sing for you, it's going to be a welcoming song. It's going to be to welcome you, to our land here today, to, get our day started in a good way. Whatever drum beat we're doing, again, many different nations have different beats, but they all have this sort of 1-2 beat. And what that's representing is the heartbeat of Mother Earth. And it's a sound that's very soothing to all of us because it was our first sound that we've heard. It was our mother's heartbeat. So whenever we make songs, it's with that beat. What we kind of offer here is a lot of different workshops. Our basic programming is our intro to Indigenous culture, kind of giving people a big picture look at to what Indigenous culture is And then they kind of have a lot of add-ons that they can do onto it, a lot of different art workshops, dance workshops, music workshops, again, all to kind of give you that big picture look at to what Indigenous culture is. And we really tried to get that across, you know, where we're talking about how our people lived cyclical lives, where we would move with nature and have that connection with the land.
You good boys. You good boy.
When I first heard of the Ojibway spirit horses during the pandemic, I think I was so blown away because, you know, being an Ojibway person myself, I'm from Curve Lake First Nation, as are my daughters, members of Curve Lake, and we've been very involved in the equestrian world for, you know, many years now. You know, I called straight home to my auntie and I was like, what is this about Ojibway spirit horses? And I think if I was in those two worlds and I had not heard of them, to me it was such a big part of our story and our history that Canadians and our own community who have lost touch over all of these years of colonization, lost touch with the horses and what they meant to us, how they were, you know, sacred beings and partners and lived in harmony with our communities, and that we had all lost touch, you know, of those stories and those teachings. And so they really give a good opportunity to share those stories with the public, but also to allow our community to rebuild those connections and get to have that connection with the spirit horses. So this here is Cedar Gijik. She was the first foal we ever had born here at Medawaki Farm, and she's actually a really great example of some of our Ojibway horse breed markers. And she's got the really fuzzy ears you can see here. So it helps this time of year with the bugs and in our Canadian winters. She's got a beautiful dun color, is the color of her coat. She's got kind of the tri-colored mane, and she has the dorsal stripe going down her back as well. She's got some really great tiger striping, the horse striping on her leg. She is a perfect example of our Ojibway spirit horse breed. The last four were actually near Lac La Croix First Nation in Ontario. You know, there's a beautiful story about there was a number of men who were really concerned that we were almost losing this breed, and they knew the history of them. So there was Fred Isham, who was an Indigenous man, had gotten together some Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners and said, we have to save these last four. They captured them, rescued them, and actually took them across the ice into the northern U.S. And I think at the time everybody believed they were, you know, Mustangs or related to the Mustangs, and it was through the DNA they realized this was a distinct breed. And so they've slowly started making their way back into Canada, although they are found in the northern U.S. as well. And slowly, through really dedicated efforts of the Ojibway Horse Society, been rebuilding this breed, and they are still rare and endangered. There's less than 200, so they are far off from being off the endangered list. We had lost the last stallion to the breed, was shot accidentally, believing it was a moose in the forest. So when these last four horses were rounded up and taken over the ice, the heist across the ice they call it, when they were taken over to northern U.S., they realized these were the very last horses. There was no stallions left to continue the breed. And so the decision was made to breed the mares with a Mustang, with Smoky Mustang, who shared a lot of the same breed characteristics. So through the generations, it has gotten, you know, closer to full-blooded, but they were bred with a Mustang.
And he's got beautiful mixed mane, and he's got the startings here of all of the striping on the legs.
I do think a lot of these reconciliation efforts put a lot of onus on the community to be the ones teaching and sharing and changing perspectives. And I think it's important to recognize that, you know, not every single Indigenous person has that knowledge and teachings. You know, they've grown up often in an urban area, disconnected from their elders and culture. And so I think that's challenging. And, you know, and I think it's a little challenging to expect our communities that are in various stages of healing through that process to be the ones sharing that message too. Which is why I think, you know, again, Indigenous tourism, I think, is that, you know, that balance. We ensure that all of our cultural ambassadors they're knowledgeable, they've gotten teachings from the elders and the community, and they're sharing something that's appropriate, something their community supports in them sharing, that they have the background and knowledge to do so. And I think it's important for that financial or economic reconciliation, because it's not just putting the community in the position of having to be the teachers, but it's giving them employment and opportunities to do it, for an income and not at their own burden. So I think that tourism creates that space, and brings the right resources to the people that have the knowledge and teachings to be able to share.
We get that question a lot. What can I do? How can I learn? How can I learn about Indigenous people? How can I learn about the culture? And we're in very much of a time right now where it's this kind of gray area, right? We're in a time of truth and reconciliation where, Canadians are trying to learn about Indigenous people. They're trying to learn about Indigenous issues, and they're trying to do it in a safe way. That's a big part of what this place is all about here, is we're trying to create that safe space, for regular Canadians to come here, to come and learn about Indigenous people without feeling, shunned or, whatever feelings that they kind of get over that. But my advice whenever I speak to people about learning about the culture is to go to those communities. Wherever you are in Canada, it doesn't matter which city, which town you're in, within 2-3 hours there is an Indigenous community near you. I always say go to powwows, go to these celebrations that are, open to the public, and go there with an open mind. Go there to learn, listen, talk. Don't be afraid to speak with the elders, speak with the dancers, the singers, ask questions. Always ask questions.
And that is the agenda for Monday, June 16th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, as wildfires continue to ravage parts of the country, are we prepared to do anything about climate change? We'll explore that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.